you have turned it on, yeah?
Yeah.
Perfect.
So he even double checked for you. There you go. Cool. Okay. Welcome to Building Communities, a podcast brought to you by Nationwide. In this series, we're going to be addressing the issues surrounding UK housing, and now more than ever, with the cost of living crisis impacting the lives of so many people across the country, it's never been more important for us as a nation to use our mutual purpose to help make a difference to people who need housing the most. I'm your host, I'm Hayley McQueen, and in this episode, well, I have the opportunity to help lift the lid on some of these issues alongside some amazing guests, of whom I have for this podcast too. They're going to be telling their stories, whether that's telling us about the inspiring work that their charities are doing to help combat these housing issues, working on the front lines, or first-hand experience of falling victim to homelessness. These stories are certainly going to be powerful. And in today's episode, I'm joined by Phil, who's bravely going to be sharing his inspiring story about how he unfortunately found himself in a situation of homelessness and how eventually he sought help from the Shelter charity to find his feet in a very difficult time. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here. It's great that you are
Good to be here.
Yeah, you're one of the many who have sought help.
Yeah.
And one of the many who found themselves in a situation I can only imagine you never thought you would be in. Take us back to, was it about 8 years ago when your life was just ticking along as normal, and unfortunately a series of events led to things almost spiralling out of control.
Indeed. Absolutely. I was married. I'd been with my partner for around 19 years. I had a solid career in aerospace technology, spanning almost 3 decades. And I was responsible for overseas business development. So a lot of high flying, a lot of travelling involved, probably around 40%. And it was a very responsible job. There was a crossroads in my life around 8 years ago. Basically, I'm an only child, no siblings, and my mum and dad were both terminally ill at the same time. So my mum had cancer, my dad had Alzheimer's. And concurrently to that, my son unfortunately required 4 major heart operations. So everything started to happen all in one go. I was obviously under a lot of pressure from my company to travel abroad. They would be turning around and saying, shouldn't Phil be in Tokyo this week? And in actual fact, I was either at Birmingham Children's Hospital, sort of nursing my son along with his mum, and or I'd be dashing around trying to get my parents into care and combating the authorities trying to get the help that they needed. So there was a lot of pressure going on at that time, trying to keep the plates spinning.
I mean, goodness me, I can't even imagine what that must have been like emotionally to have to deal with your own child being ill, and then on the flip side, having to look after your parents as well. You were dealing with a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. What happened with your workplace, and why do you think they maybe couldn't understand what was going on in your life, and why allowances maybe needed to be made to allow you to care on both sides of your family?
Yeah. I think they sort of bent as far as they possibly could, but there was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of dynamics going on with the company. They were actually gearing themselves up to be sold themselves, and they were restructuring organisations. So, I was given the opportunity to remain in the company, but it would have meant moving to the States, which was obviously a non-starter with my son's situation and my parents who died within 4 months of that scenario. I can kind of understand why the company had to let me go, but it was a very, very difficult spot. Very difficult.
I can only imagine. I mean, dealing with the heartache and then having to deal with your life changing from an industry that you'd worked in, as you've mentioned, for many decades,
Yeah.
and then having to think, right, what next? And what
Yeah.
was next?
Well, I'd always been interested in filming and photography, and my wife, who was very supportive at the time, suggested that I really push and have a completely change in direction. I was pretty burned out by that point. All the travelling and the pressure of my parents and my son, bless him, kind of I was very much in a feeling burnt out, and I really needed to get off that high pressure corporate rat race. So I retrained in photography and filming, and it's a very competitive area, and I needed 2 knee replacements, so it was difficult to sort of chase brides around golf courses. It was a very difficult thing to get into. I found a bit of a niche in providing families with life story tribute videos, so I would go to families, scan old photos, digitally restore them, and then put them together set to music as a tasteful tribute video. I had a more portable display system which I'd deploy at events, but it never really took off. It was always kind of bumping along.
And then you found yourself splitting from your wife, and then that meant, of course, that there was a situation where you found yourself moving out of the family home.
Yeah.
And what happened with that?
Well, it was something that it really caught me off guard. It had obviously been brewing for a while. I think the pressure had not helped. It tends to come out in all sorts of ways. But my wife decided she wanted a divorce, and that was it really. So. Retrospectively, I think she made the right choice. It's better to be apart and happy. It was a very difficult time indeed, very difficult. Yeah. But we move on.
But you have a young son who's going through his own troubles. You're going through your emotional troubles of going through a breakup.
Yeah.
I'm sure still very devastated about the loss of both parents within a short space of time.
Yeah.
The loss of your job. I mean, any one of these things is life changing. I imagine your mental health must have really suffered as well.
It did. It took quite a battering. Certainly, from a stress point of view, it was off the charts. It was manifesting itself in really quite chronic depression, it was something that was a really sort of crushing feeling. A lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. And it ultimately transpired that all of these things, it was actually diagnosed as quite an acute case of PTSD. But it's, when you're going through these things, it's difficult to take the time to look after yourself. Yeah. You're constantly dealing with all of these things, and your own inner well-being sometimes takes a back seat. And it's it's not always easy to diagnose these things and recognise they need to be dealt with.
Yeah, you did then find yourself in rented accommodation, and it got to a point where you were then having to live in your car through an unfortunate series of events, and then before you knew it, you needed help. How was life at that point? Yeah,
there's a kind of another, you might want to cut this in earlier on, but I also lost my house. That was another thing that sort of caught me by surprise. I had a girlfriend by this time. This was about 9 months on. And I was sort of living with her for most of the time. I built up a mental block really regarding the cottage where I was living. It was where my parents had been. And I found it quite a drain. It needed an awful lot of work doing to it, and it was very damp. And I felt myself just sort of losing grip of it, really. And I was going to my girlfriend's, staying there, blocking out the things I needed to do, the post I needed to open. And then one day I came back to the property after not being there for 2 months, and there were great big padlocks externally bolted to the house, and an A4 piece of paper, a notice for me to quit. That my mortgage lender, unfortunately, had, I hadn't responded to my post, and I lost my house.
And then you eventually ended up, you were no longer in this relationship, and I guess you thought, okay, well, you rented for a little while, and then ended up in your car just through desperation of just needing somewhere to be.
My cousin had always been fairly supportive, and I decided to basically, because I'd always been, they were about 3.5 hours away down in Clacton. I was from Derbyshire originally. And they had properties that they let out, and against my better judgment, I decided to move into one of the properties that they had available. It was right opposite their house, and mixing family with a rigid commercial structure such as a tenancy agreement doesn't always mix too well. I had issues with my cousin's husband because they could see everything. So closely, it was like living in a goldfish bowl. Unfortunately, he had issues whereby if things didn't go his way, he became violent. So I was attacked, unfortunately, and that led to me. That was my first encounter with homelessness, because I didn't feel safe to go back to the property. I had to call the police, and so I moved into a small hotel in Harwich at that point. And I was desperately working on my business, trying to prop that up, trying to drum up new business, working on my laptop with websites and spending money on Google AdWords, desperately trying to drum up new business, thinking that this would all be a temporary stopgap, and I'd be able to rent somewhere again and move on. But of course, it didn't really work out. COVID then kicked in, and so my business really took a hammering from that point of view, and I was really reliant on pension money. So, with funds really ebbing away, I very reluctantly decided to move into my car. And that was around this time last Christmas, so just before Christmas. And I didn't take the decision lightly, but I really felt I had no choice. Again, thinking that would be short term. But yeah, it was a very, very difficult time. I was spending a huge amount of money on a cup of coffee from Starbucks, and I'd make that last 7 hours. And
get the free Wi-Fi as well thrown in.
Absolutely, I'd be there with my laptop and the Wi-Fi would be going. And I used their disabled loos to keep a reasonable standard of hygiene. And then, food-wise, I've always enjoyed cooking and eating reasonably well. But I found myself, having no alternative, no way to cook things. So I would get, cold microwave meals. I was living on those from Morrison's, and then, every now and again as a special treat, I'd have a Big Mac of, I've not been back to McDonald's for a year. So yeah, that was very, very tough, and just around Christmas I'd go to the loo, for example, in Sainsbury's, and I'd be bombarded with Christmas music. There would be the sight of families enjoying Christmas shopping, getting all the turkey and all the stuff. I'd go in the loo, come out in tears, really, knowing I was going back to a cold car. Watching the fuel gauge going down and down and down, as thinking my money's running out, I can't afford to put fuel in the vehicle, and I unfortunately I was locked out of my storage, so all my warm clothing and bedding was locked away.
Because you'd had to put that in storage, all your property and belongings.
Exactly.
Gosh.
So unfortunately, they play hardball. If you owe them money, the first thing they do is change the locks. And they wouldn't let me get my stuff, so that was very difficult. I was wrapping clothes around me, desperately trying to keep warm, and then, as I say, put the heater on periodically through the night. Then the heater packed up, but I hit really a crunch point I was down to the last £50, and I was loathed to. I was really loathed to not give my son something for Christmas. I couldn't afford to go and buy something, but you know, with him also being into photography and filming and studying, I had a rather a good camera bag that I had in the boot of my car that I emptied my stuff out of, and thought, well, he'll probably benefit from that. And I remember standing in the post office. This was really the crisis point. Stood there in the line of the post office, crossing all my fingers, hoping that it wasn't going to be too expensive to send this box back up to the Midlands. You know, and it came, I don't know, to whatever, £11, and I breathed a sigh of relief because I could afford to send it. And I thought, my God, I need to do something now. This is really bad. I contacted the Samaritans, and they were a good ear. They were good to talk to, but no real tangible help. And it was at that point I turned to shelter.
And how were you feeling at that time about, was it a case of plucking up the courage to do it?
I think throughout all of this, there's a big part of me that was in denial.
Yeah.
You know, I always felt, oh, just round the corner, you know, I'll get some calls and business will pick up. I never really took myself in hand and took the bull by the horn and said, come on, Phil, you need to jolt out of this.
And did you not have anybody, you obviously, you're great to talk to, you're a great personality, you're a great character, you're very much in touch with your son right now. We've had a few good chats before recording this podcast. I'm sure you had friends who thought like I do about you. You're an intelligent, lovely person. Surely one of these friends would have reached out and wanted to help you. Or do you think nobody was aware of what was happening?
To be honest, I was embarrassed. It was an embarrassing situation to be in. Everyone had known me as this successful business person, and you know, it was too embarrassing. And as I mentioned before, I have no siblings, and apart from my son, the only family I'd got was my cousin, who was who I had been renting the house off while I was ostracised from all of my family because I involved the police with that. So there's no way I could turn to them. And my other cousin in Norwich, who was the brother of my cousin, you know, everyone immediately just sided with that side of the family, and
probably not knowing your circumstances.
Yeah,
either.
of course, and I didn't, you know, and when I have done things to help shelter, raise awareness, I've done a couple of media centred things now. You know, they've seen it online, and the only contact I've had is, why didn't you do this, or why didn't you do that? You know, it's just a non-starter really. So
would you advise other people, if they found themselves in your position, you eventually went to shelter and got help, we'll talk about that in a minute, to reach out to family members, to reach out to friends?
Definitely. You know, it's difficult when you've got a son that's late teens. I know when I was a teenager, I didn't like the thought of my parents not being in a good place. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, it would be better if I didn't really involve my son with all of this. Again, thinking things will be better around the corner. So I didn't really share any of it with my son until afterwards, until things were getting a lot better. You know, being homeless is something, it took a while of actually being homeless before I acknowledged to myself that I was in fact homeless. It was just something alien to me, you know, completely.
And there's a stereotype of what a homeless person is, or how we view a homeless person.
Absolutely.
It's not somebody sitting on the street in a major city hoping that someone's going to put some coins into a box as you pass, who might have drug or alcohol problems, which is a terrible stereotype. And I guess you might have had that in your head. Well, I'm not this and I'm not that, so I'm not really homeless.
Absolutely. As far as I was concerned, homeless, and you know, I'd always sort of given a little bit to homeless people when I see them, but always felt that they were, it is an awful thing to say, but I always considered them to be people that were either drug dependent or alcoholics. And there's no question some are, but as we'll get further on, I've encountered lots of people that aren't, and people from a very wide cross section of society.
Yeah, I can only imagine how that must have felt to have had to reach out to some Samaritans to give you a bit of emotional help, somebody to finally speak to and let it out. What did that feel like?
It was a great release. As I said, the main thing for me was really having that help. I decided to contact Shelter, and the lady who I spoke with there, her name was Jenny. She was really good. I wasn't expecting this at all. She was unhurried. She let me tell my story. I was upset throughout some of the chat. And she listened to everything, and then at the end she helped me put together a plan of where to deal with, how to deal with day-to-day things, where to get hot food, where to get my washing done, but then also longer term things, who to contact in terms of benefits and the council to get on some sort of housing register. I knew nothing about benefits, going on the dole, as far as I was concerned, was something you just didn't do. And that's how my mentality was. But she kind of pointed out to me that I'd been a taxpayer for many years, decades in fact, and it was my time to get some help, and that I shouldn't feel embarrassed or guilty about getting that help. And she made it okay for me to do that. And from there on in, everything completely changed. I had a couple of calls with Jenny. It was quite probably a couple of hours worth of chat. I'd say there was no hurry, but everything around that changed everything. It was then an upward trajectory from there on in. And I made calls. When you're in that headspace and you've got, by that time quite, I was suicidal at that point. There's no question. When you're in that sort of headspace, you really do find that it's. Lost the track.
No.
Losing the thought. When you're in that sort of headspace, it really is an effort to do things, just normal day-to-day tasks. So picking up the phone and making a call to the benefits office or the council would take quite a lot of energy. It would really be quite draining. But what I found was once I started that, the people that I spoke with were proactive back towards me, and I'd be getting contacts from them. So it was gaining traction and momentum. So these people were, putting things in place. The benefits were then sorted, and I then found a place in a temporary sheltered accommodation. Which kicked in actually over Christmas Day and Boxing Day. Wow. And it was definitely no frills, and there were some scallywags there without any question, but it was, if you treat people with respect, you generally find that they're fine with you. So I was really quite intrepid about going in this place, but people were great, and I bonded with them. As I mentioned, I like cooking. I'd be making a curry for 12 on a Saturday night, and there was a family there that were between houses, and little Emma, she was about 11 I think, she would help me chop the herbs and spices, and her parents could see all of that, and they sort of took a liking to me, and we've remained really good friends since. Wow. So I've met some really good friends through that, and it was really a lifesaver over last Christmas.
Literally lifesaver.
Yeah, it really was.
It's quite interesting what you say there about when you called and you spoke to this person, Jenny, that you are chatting to the same person each time. So they have your story, they know your story, and they make sure that as and when you call, this is the same person who looks after your, I don't know if you would call it sort of a case, I guess, and look
absolutely.
after you.
Yeah.
And they make a point of doing that.
Absolutely. And, in my case, I just needed those pointers. That was enough. So it wasn't something that needed follow-up. It was really just 2 calls.
Yeah.
But I know that, shelter gear themselves for the individual case, and some people have been helped throughout a longer period of time. It's really geared to what the need is.
When you were in the absolute darkest of places, which was at that time,
Yeah.
did you then quite quickly start to see that bit of light ahead and a future?
Very much so. It really was a lightning turnaround. With these calls coming in, the temporary accommodation, they then found me an apartment which was warm, dry, nice atmosphere. There was a community. If I wanted to engage socially with people, I could do that. And but that's where I'm living now, which is in a great space. And it's given me the opportunity to, instead of focusing on the day-to-day survival aspects of life, it's allowed me to have a clearer headspace. So I can be creative again, which is something I enjoy. So I'm currently studying microelectronics and coding, and I've got a 3D printer, so I can sit and have coffee in the morning, sketch up some wacky idea, and then come evening that it'll come off on the 3D printer. So I'm hoping to run my own business again in the fullness of time. But I've got, let's say, a health journey to get through, really get my knee operations done. But that's my intention.
And how did you find dealing with things like the NHS when you have no fixed abode and trying to get appointments for things and try to anything that you call up for? One of the things they ask is your name, your date of birth, an email address, and of course an address.
Well, everything health related, I pretty much put on hold. I mean, I needed for my knee scenario, I needed pain control, and I just didn't renew my prescriptions for that. For depression, I needed medication as well. So I kind of I sort of ignored those needs really throughout that period. There are consequences to having lost your home. Day-to-day things, just trying to open a bank account for my benefits to go into was nigh on impossible. I remember spending 3 days wandering around from bank to bank because I hadn't got that footprint of whatever they needed, the criteria to open an account with your address firmly fixed. Because I was in a temporary accommodation, it was impossible to open an account. There was one online bank which I was able to do it with, but not after a lot of blood, sweat and tears. And small things like not being able to get your post. There's a lot of bad consequences to not opening your post. Just silly little things like a parking ticket that I didn't even realise that I'd done, and that accrued and built up. And then suddenly, before you know where you are, there's a warrant against your vehicle for repossession of your vehicle, and you've got no knowledge of it. You just get a phone call from some debt collector telling them that they're on the way round. Well, I don't quite know where the on the way round was going to be, but that's the sort of thing that you have to deal with.
And what about getting your possessions back as well?
There was no leeway in that. I had to find the money, and so the first couple of months of benefits were, they reluctantly agreed on a payment plan whereby they split it into a couple of payments, but there was certainly no charity from the storage company.
Wow. And how have you found the people that you've encountered since this that you discuss your situation with? Or you might just meet a stranger and you just get chatting, and then organically you tell them about your journey, your story.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something you necessarily volunteer straight away, but there are certainly you know, within, like I say, I have done a couple of initiatives for shelter. I was involved with the carol service last week at St Martin's, where I gave a small speech to a group of people who were sponsors, one of which was nationwide. And you know, the love in that room. I did a 5-minute bit on my story, and the warmth from people, and the good wishes from people that afterwards, you know, was absolutely lovely. And so I found not a respect, but I was surprised for people to be as understanding and as warm about my situation, because you always think, oh, if only I'd done this, or if only I'd done that. You always feel inadequate. You always feel you know, that you let yourself down. There's always that feeling. So it's good to be able to do something that's positive, you know, adding a little bit back. Yeah. So yeah, by and large, the response from people is really positive.
Yeah. And what about the relationship that you have with your son now? And you've obviously spoken to him about what you went through and the experiences you unfortunately have had to live.
Yeah. I mean, that was quite a bumpy road. As I say, I didn't really want to volunteer my situation, but because my son was quite close to my cousin. Unfortunately, I won't go into all the nitty-gritty of it, but my cousin certainly put the poison down, and it created a bad vibe with my son. And I didn't have the strength really to fight my corner, to say, look, that's not how it is, you know, it's, you know. So, but a long story short, everything's good with him now. We've had a long chat since then, and he's visited me in my current place. We've got a great Christmas planned. He's going to be visiting me for a few days, so we're going to do a lot of great things, a lot of fun. So things are really good at the moment, and the relationship with my son's fabulous.
And what about that camera bag and the stuff that you gave him? Is he putting that to good use?
Oh, he is, yes. He's studying filming and photography down at Falmouth University at the moment, and he's doing really well.
Good. So he's following his passion. You are still, which is good to see,
yes.
that the work that you're throwing yourself into is something you actually genuinely want to do and care about, and you're hopefully going to make something of that.
Yeah. Run
your own business.
Yeah.
And the future is looking really good for you. Are you feeling just a real sense of positivity?
I feel completely rebooted, and strangely, you know, it sounds like a huge ordeal that I've been through, but I actually feel I feel that I don't have regrets about any of it. I feel a better person throughout having come out through the other side, being in a better place now mentally, and you know, just looking forward to the future, Phil 2.0, onwards and upwards.
Yeah, and I guess as well for a life that, with small things all adding up to spiralling out of control, you're very much in control of your situation now and can help others who might unfortunately find themselves in a similar situation, particularly with the way that things are looking at the moment in this country, with, you know, the rise in cost of living and problems that people may find themselves in.
Yes, yeah, very much so. You know, you become very sensitive to it. You know, I sometimes go to the library for a change of scenery, and I take my laptop there, and I'm sort of working away. And I was in the library. That was a warm place to be when I was homeless. And you spot people who are doing the same thing, and it makes you want to go over to them and say, listen, mate, do yourself a favour, contact these people, contact shelter before it's too late. Because, you know, my only regret was that I didn't engage with shelter much further upstream. You know, I could have changed things drastically if I'd spoken with them, you know, at the point of my house being in jeopardy. I should have involved them at that point, because they're not just about people who are homeless. They help people who are at risk of losing their home, and that's something I didn't know anything about, and I kind of regret not engaging with them much sooner in the process.
So that would be your word of advice to
Most
anyone
definitely.
who is looking at the future and
It's never too late, but jump in and get help as early as you can in that process.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about the stereotype of homeless people, and you know there are people from all walks of life who are receiving help from shelters. Homelessness can happen to anyone, as you've just explained there, and I guess we're living in a world now where we need to be kind to each other and we need to look after each other's mental health
Yes.
as well. What would you say to somebody who's might not be homeless right now, but sitting at home worried about how their future is looking and worried about the rising costs and worried about losing a lot of things that you've unfortunately had to go through and experience?
You know, whether it's your mortgage lender, your bank, or your utility companies, I've been surprised at how understanding they can all be. And you know, you think they're going to jump down your throat, but if you try and phone them early on in the process, try and, you know, before it gets really bad, just try and engage with them, and you'll be surprised at how flexible they can be. You know, I think that's the biggest takeaway with it really, is dialogue and communication. There's no magic wand, you know, short of winning the lottery. There's no magic wand that can necessarily deal with those problems. But if you're in that situation, lots of other people are in that situation. That, you know, you're not on your own. Although it feels like it, there's a lot of other people that are in the same boat. So reach out and get some support.
And just finally, the relationship with your ex-wife broke down. You had a girlfriend, and that relationship ended, and you've got the most incredible relationship now with shelter. I guess you've got that, haven't you? Which is
Very
something
much
you
so.
can focus on. What would you?
They're my girlfriend at the minute.
There you go. So what would you say to shelter and all that they do and the people that work for them that come together to help?
Well, words can't, you know, as I always say, that intervention with shelter absolutely saved my life. There's no question. You know, I was on the point of throwing myself off Orwell Bridge at one point. I was really feeling suicidal, and those phone calls completely turned my life around without any exaggeration. You know, these guys are great, and the work that I've done with them subsequent to me landing back on my feet, they've been really lovely people to work with. They're a fantastic organisation, and they really do an amazing job.
And I'm sure they will thank you for all that you've done to put back into them to help.
That's the least I can do.
Somebody else. It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm just so sorry that you've had to go through all that. It's great to speak to you here, but I almost wish you weren't here, because that would mean you didn't have to go through all of this.
Well, there's no
you know,
gain without pain. Yeah.
Well, the future is certainly looking bright. We wish you all the very best. Thank you for coming today and just sharing and being so open about an incredible story, really.
You're most welcome.
And thank you to everyone for listening as well and joining us for today's Building Communities, brought to you by Nationwide. If you'd like to find out more about the amazing work that Shelter do in helping people like Phil, visit shelter.org.uk or call their free helpline 0808 800 4444.